Okay, good morning. This week's Parsha is Parshat Va'era. The climax of this week's Parsha is the very last event that's narrated, and that is the event known as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. We know that Abraham and Sarah had been promised by God that they would have a biological child, and at the ripe old age of right around 100, they were blessed with a child by the name of Isaac, or Yitzchak in Hebrew. Some years later, Abraham received a command from God to take his one son, that is the one son he had with Sarah, and offer him up as a sacrifice. What is the message of this narrative for us? So the first thing we need to talk about is the whole concept of a test, known in Hebrew as a nisayon. Why does God need to test us? Why did God need to test Abraham? God certainly knows in advance what we are capable of doing, what our strengths are, what our challenges are. So why exactly was there a test? What was the purpose of this test? So there are a few different approaches that are offered in answer to this question. One approach is that of Maimonides. Maimonides writes in his book, The Guide for the Perplexed, that the word nisayon in Hebrew, usually translated as a test, actually is based upon the word, or comes from the root nes. Now a nes is usually translated as a miracle, but a nes can also mean a banner or a flag. And Maimonides suggests that the purpose of this narrative, the purpose of this episode, was to demonstrate to the world how to properly obey divine commands. The performance of the trial is not the desired end, Maimonides notes, but is instead an example for our instruction. Again, hence the name Nes, banner. This narrative, Maimonides continues, demonstrates two very important principles of our faith. Number one, it demonstrates the extent of one's obligation to fear God. As I mentioned, Abraham was quite old when his wife Sarah gave birth to Isaac, and God had promised Abraham that Isaac would be his spiritual inheritor, that he would be the start of progeny that would ultimately grow into a great nation. Maimonides notes that Abraham's love for Isaac was no doubt even greater for these reasons, greater than one might assume that a man would have for his son for these reasons. Yet when the command came from God to take this son and slaughter him, Abraham set aside all personal considerations to comply with God's command. Not because Abraham was concerned about divine punishment, but instead as a result of man's duty, of humanity's duty to love and fear God. This is why, after Abraham had successfully played his role here, we would say passed this test, the angel informs him, "Now I know that you are a God-fearing man and that you can serve as a model of the extent of one's obligation to fear God." Again, this was accomplished because Abraham was commanded to perform an act that surpasses any other sacrifice of property or life. It belongs to the class of actions believed to be contrary to human feelings and emotions. The second principle that Maimonides says is demonstrated in this narrative is that a prophet must unquestionably confirm and adhere to the principles of the truth of the prophecy, regardless of the difficulty involved in doing so. As we mentioned on previous occasions, Maimonides mentions that when a prophet received a communication from God, there was no doubt as to the veracity of the prophecy. This was clearly a message from God, and Abraham appropriately, unquestioningly obeyed it. The second approach is that of the Abarbanel, or some people refer to him as Abravanel. There's an interesting history involved in the life of this particular commentator. He actually was the treasurer for Ferdinand and Isabella, as of the Columbus fame, and tried to intercede with them when the decree was made right around the time of Columbus's voyage to America to expel the Jews from their country. They graciously agreed to exempt him from this decree, but he refused to accept that offer and left with his fellow Jews in exile to other countries. At any rate, this great commentator notes that the purpose of this narrative is to demonstrate the firm faith that we have in the eternity of the soul and a belief in the hereafter. Only with such faith, Abarbanel suggests, could Abraham find the inner strength to be able to withstand this trial and be prepared to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac. The final approach that I wanted to share with you in answer to this question is offered by not Maimonides, but Nachmanides, who was a younger contemporary of Maimonides, and he suggests the following. Even though God knows in advance what we are capable of doing, but a test, a trial, has an impact on the individual being tested. Because before the test unfolds, the individual may very well have the ability to withstand the test. He may very well have the potential, he or she may have the potential to withstand the test, but bringing that potential strength into realization, into actuality, makes the individual a different person thereafter. So Abraham, as great as he was, and Abraham who had the ability to withstand this trial, became a different and greater individual once he actually had to carry it out. One final point I would make here about this episode of the binding of Isaac, and that is, of course, that in Jewish tradition this represented in many ways the final test, at least in terms of difficulty, that Abraham had to withstand, and secured his relationship with God and that of his descendants for future generations. But not so well known is the fact that the Torah records that immediately before the birth of Isaac, Sarah was actually taken captive by a gentleman by the name of Avimelech, who was the king of Gerar. This led to a great deal of scoffing and cynicism on the part of the people of Abraham's generation at the time of the binding of Yitzhak. We know how people like to tell tall tales. Many people claimed that Abraham, far from receiving a command from God to kill Isaac, decided to kill Isaac because Isaac might very well have been the illegitimate child of his wife Sarah with Avimelech. Rabbi Soloveitchik broadens this idea and says the following. I want to quote from the book Abraham's Journey. He notes, "The absurdity and laughability of Abraham's career reached its apex, that is, its highest point, in the Akedah." The Akedah is this binding episode, the binding of Isaac. Many were impressed by the tragic aspect of the Akedah, by the traumatic and dramatic experience of a heroic father about to lose his son. Abraham and Sarah had an experience that would have broken the body and shattered the spirit of anyone else. But this is not its greatness, Rabbi Soloveitchik continues. God promised a son to Abraham, one who was supposed to perpetuate everything Abraham preached and everything he stood for. Years passed. Abraham and Sarah aged. Their bodies weakened, and still they waited for the invisible God to realize his promise. Finally, the impossible happened, and Isaac was born. Then the call came to Abraham to take his son, whose arrival he had expected patiently for so long, and to sacrifice him. Did not people say that the relationship between Abraham and his God bordered on the insane and psychopathic? That Abraham worshipped a God of cruelty, who rejoiced in the agony, misery, and anguish of his most devoted servants? That a God of viciousness and dreadful malice had somehow entranced Abraham and enslaved him? They laughed, they derided, and they mocked and condemned him mercilessly. In the epic of the Akedah, the heroism demonstrated by Abraham expressed itself not so much in his readiness to incur martyrdom and the loss of a child, as in his willingness to endure the scornful ridicule and derision of society. All this is a consequence of the new role foisted on Abraham, that of the straying wanderer. Part of the test that Abraham endured was that all the while that he was manifesting, that he was demonstrating the supreme sacrifice to God, he realized that this would be looked at in far different terms by his contemporaries, that he would in fact be derided, that he would be condemned, that he would not be considered as a role model, but instead will be considered as a madman and someone to be shunned. This truly, according to Rabbi Soloveitchik, represented the greatness of Abraham, that he put aside all considerations, including that of what we'll call popularity, in order to fulfill God's will. Thank you so much.